This is a Dell Optiplex 7040 that has been upgraded with a GTX 1650 Super. Now it's going to get a cooling upgrade. First, we're going to install a front fan and get some airflow and some cool air to our GPU. We're going to make an easy case mod to cool our CPU and get the heat out of the case with Dell's stock 90mm fan. Keep watching to see just how much these cooling upgrades help. This Optiplex 7040 has been upgraded to a very capable gaming PC, but I wanted to see how much better I could get the cooling. Looking at the front panel, Dell's got a great design with all this vertically angled mesh, and it provides a ton of airflow. However, they made a mistake by blocking the piece that covers the 5¼ optical bay. Our model already has a slim laptop optical drive, and with optical discs going by the wayside, this PC will basically never use this bay. So what I'm going to do is cut this solid back panel off and try to leave the clips on each end so I can snap it back in. You can see that it's held on by these plastic rivet type things. I'm going to leave the two on each end to keep the clips in place and try to snap off the inside of the plastic panel. We'll get back to that later. I'm not a snob about a computer having to be completely silent, but cooling is no good if it's obnoxiously loud, so I'm going to compare acoustics. Our PC with the stock cooling is nearly silent at idle at around 40 decibels. And under full load with the fans fully spun up is just under 60 decibels. Inside the case, the first thing I want to point out is that the metal on the optical bay drive partially covers the CPU fan. That has to block airflow to the CPU, at least a little. Taking a look at the front of the case from the inside, you can see there are a lot of good holes in the middle for airflow, and that should feed air to our front fan just fine. But our optical bay doesn't have anything to hinder the airflow, as there's no metal and we'll be able to get direct airflow through that mesh on the front. We only have enough room for an 80mm fan to add as our front case fan, so I've chosen a Noctua RF80 Redux. I'm not going to go into specs much other than to say that it moves a decent amount of air and is quiet, and with Noctua you're always going to get a good fan. This one is also under $10, so it's a good value. And I do prefer the gray and black that Noctua went with as opposed to their classic browns. Since we don't have any fan headers, I've chosen a SATA to dual 4-pin fan adapter. A 2-pack was about $7 on Amazon. And as you can see, you've got SATA power on one side and a female fan connector on the other. The connector will take 3 or 4-pin fan connectors. I am going to place our fan blowing in on the front of the case, and all I've done to secure it is use zip ties to the front metal panel. Not the most elegant solution, but it works fine. I do also want to mention that I tried placing the fan at the end of the GPU, and I also tried 2 fans in kind of a series configuration, but neither performed any better in testing, so I went back to just a single fan on the front of the case. But now, this is a problem. Connected to the fan splitter and running at a full 12 volts, the fan is over 60 decibels and obnoxiously loud with the rest of the system at idle. I thought the noise might have something to do with the mesh on the front of the case not being able to provide enough air to the fan, but even outside the case with no blockage, it was still reading almost 60 decibels. The sound forced me to head out to my workbench and make my own cable to slow the fan down. I've got a couple of these SATA power splitters, and what I'm going to do is switch the 5V and 12V power cables to hopefully make things quieter. The yellow wire on the SATA power cable carries 12V and the red carries 5V. That means if I switch them and make my own crossover cable, I can run the fan at 5V. I'm just going to cut the cables, go from red to yellow and yellow to red, solder them together and call it good. I'll start by cutting my wires and stripping back about a 1/2 inch for a lead to put the wires together. Then I'll put some appropriately sized heat shrink onto the wires so I can cover them nicely after they're soldered together. If your wire strands come apart, it can be a little tougher to get heat shrink on, so try to keep them together the best you can. Then I like to fan out my cables and push them together, then twist them in opposite directions. And while I've been preparing the wires, I've also had my soldering iron heating up, so it'll be ready to use when we need it. Then I'll add some solder to the wires to hold them together. I do like to tack a fresh piece of solder on to touch the wire and help transfer the heat, and then you can just hold your wire on one side and some solder on the other, and it'll suck some in and cover your new joint. And finally, I'll slide down my heat shrink and use a lighter to add a little bit of heat to shrink it down and make sure that the bare wire is covered completely so it doesn't short anything out. All we have to do now is plug in the new 5-volt wire before the fan splitter, and we'll see how much it helps with the noise. Now with the fan installed and the case front back on, we are right around 45 decibels, which is a much more acceptable noise level. Now back to getting some airflow through the optical bay. We're back out on the workbench, and I'm cutting the solid plastic panel on the back with a handsaw. This plastic is pretty thin and cuts really easily. I'm just cutting through the back panel and stopping before I hit the front of the case. And that should do it. After making a cut on each end of the plastic, the rivets are weak enough that I can just pull them apart by hand. Now we have the mesh on the front of the optical bay open, and that will provide much better airflow to our CPU. You can already tell just by looking that this is going to provide more airflow into our case. Since I kept the ends on the plastic, I still have the clips to attach it to the case. So all I have to do is line it up and snap it back in. Finally, it's time to test our cooling upgrades. I'm going to use Unigine Valley, OCCT, and Prime 95 to test, with hardware monitor running in the background to provide consistency in our readings. Starting with Unigine Valley, I'll pause to let you enjoy the most relaxing benchmark ever for a few seconds. And back on task. I hope you enjoyed the break. I've chosen to run each test for 90 minutes, then check on the GPU and CPU temps. Unigine Valley showed a stock max CPU of 65 degrees and a max GPU of 68 degrees. And after our upgrades, we've got a modest decrease of 2 degrees on our CPU, while our GPU stayed the same. With OCCT stressing the CPU more, we had stock CPU and GPU readings of 81 and 69 degrees. After our upgrade, we got a more impressive result, going down to 74 degrees on the CPU and 68 on the GPU, which is just a 1 degree decrease. But I accidentally ran the test for 2.5 hours after the upgrade, so it ran for more than an hour than our stock test. That makes a 7 degree CPU decrease look even better. And finally, with Prime 95, we've got a similar result on the CPU, going from a stock temp of 81 degrees to 74 degrees after our upgrade, which matches our 7 degree decrease in OCCT. Since Prime 95 is just a CPU stress test and doesn't test a GPU at all, our GTX 1650 Super is literally just chilling. But it does show an idle temperature of 3 degrees cooler than it was at stock. For a stock Dell case, these two cooling upgrades are definitely a success. I'm surprised to see how much the optical bay helped with the CPU temps, and our CPU and GPU are both well below their max operating range, which is going to lead to them performing reliably for years to come. Well, that's it for this video. If you liked the content, please consider subscribing, and don't forget to check out the original video, upgrading the Optiplex 7040. There will be another video soon that will upgrade the CPU from an i5 6500 to an i7 6700. We'll see how much the performance improves on our benchmarks and how our cooling holds up. If you want to check out that video, we'll see you next time, and thanks for watching.